What call to 911 did a family member try to prevent? My stepfather ripped the phone out of my hand while my little sister was seizing on the kitchen floor. Her body convulsed violently, head slamming against the tile with sounds that made my stomach turn. Foam bubbled from her mouth. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites. I dialed 3 numbers when Derek grabbed my wrist so hard I heard something crack. He threw my phone across the room where it shattered against the refrigerator. His face was inches from mine, breath hot and rank, telling me if I called anyone, he'd make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. My sister Mia was 9 years old and dying on the floor, while my stepfather threatened me into silence. I was 15 and completely alone. Derek had been part of our lives for 3 years, married to my mom for 18 months. He'd seemed normal at first, charming even. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, made good money, drove a nice car. My mom had been single since my dad left when I was 8, struggling to raise Mia and me on a teacher's salary. Derek represented stability and security. We'd moved into his house 6 months after the wedding, a big place in the suburbs with a pool and a 3-car garage. My mom was happy for the first time in years. I should have been grateful. Instead, I was watching my sister die while the man who was supposed to protect us prioritized something else entirely. Mia had been sick all week. Fever, vomiting, terrible headaches that made her cry. My mom wanted to take her to the doctor, but Derek kept saying it was just a flu bug, that doctors were expensive and unnecessary for something that would pass on its own. My mom deferred to him like she always did now. She'd become someone different since marrying Derek. Quieter, more compliant. She stopped making decisions without checking with him first. When Mia got worse instead of better, my mom mentioned the emergency room. Derek said absolutely not. He had connections in pharmaceuticals. He knew medicine. Mia just needed rest and fluids. She'd be fine by the weekend. Thursday morning, Mia collapsed getting ready for school. I heard the thud from my bedroom and found her unconscious in the hallway. My mom was already at work, gone since 6:30 for early meetings. Derek was in his home office on a conference call. I shook Mia until she woke up, confused and disoriented. She couldn't remember falling. Derek emerged from his office annoyed at the disruption. He told me to get Mia some orange juice and put her back to bed. When I said we needed to call 911, he laughed. He said I was being dramatic, that Mia was dehydrated and low on electrolytes, that emergency rooms were full of actual emergencies, and we'd waste everyone's time. I helped Mia back to her room and watched her fall asleep. Her forehead was burning. Friday afternoon was when the seizure happened. I'd stayed home from school to watch Mia since Derek had client meetings all day. My mom had texted asking how Mia was doing. I'd lied and said she was improving because I knew Derek would see the messages. He monitored my mom's phone religiously. He'd installed some app that showed him all her texts and calls in real time. She thought it was because he cared about staying connected. I knew it was control. Around 3, Mia wandered downstairs asking for water. She made it to the kitchen sink before her eyes went unfocused. I asked if she was okay. She turned toward me and collapsed, her body immediately rigid before the convulsions started. I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed 911 without thinking. The operator answered as Derek's car pulled into the garage. I heard the automatic door rising, heard his footsteps in the mudroom, and then he was there grabbing my wrist and tearing the phone away. The operator's voice was asking what my emergency was when Derek hung up. He crushed my phone under his shoe, grinding it into pieces. I tried to push past him to get to the landline in the living room, but he grabbed me by the shirt and slammed me against the wall. His face was different than I'd ever seen it, cold and calculating. He told me very clearly that if I tried to call anyone, if I told anyone what was happening, he'd make sure both Mia and I disappeared. That he had ways of handling problems that nobody would ever trace back to him. I looked at Mia still seizing on the floor. The convulsions were slowing, but she wasn't waking up. I asked Derek what was wrong with her, why he wouldn't let me get help. He told me she'd be fine, that seizures looked scary, but usually resolved on their own, that taking her to the hospital would create problems he couldn't explain. That phrase stuck with me. Problems he couldn't explain. What did that mean? I asked what he'd done to her. Derek's expression went completely blank. He said I should go to my room and stay there until he came to get me, that Mia was his responsibility now, that if I came downstairs before he gave permission, I'd regret it. Then he picked up Mia's limp body and carried her down the hallway toward his home office. I stood in the kitchen trying to process what just happened. My sister was sick with something bad enough to cause seizures. My stepfather had prevented me from calling 911 and threatened to make us disappear if I tried to get help. He'd carried Mia to his office, where he kept his pharmaceutical samples locked in a cabinet. Something was catastrophically wrong, and I had no way to contact anyone. My phone was destroyed. The landline was downstairs where Derek would hear me use it. My mom wouldn't be home for 3 more hours. I needed to get help, but Derek's threat felt real. He'd said it with such certainty, such calm assurance, that I believed he could do exactly what he promised. I went to my room like he'd ordered, but I didn't stay there. My window overlooked the backyard and the neighbor's fence. The Johnsons lived next door, a retired couple who were always home. I could climb out, jump the fence, and use their phone to call 911. But what if Derek was watching? What if he caught me trying to leave? His threat echoed in my head. make you disappear. Nobody would trace it back to him. I thought about Mia in his office, unconscious or worse. I thought about my mom coming home to find out something terrible had happened while she was at work. I thought about living with the knowledge that I'd had a chance to save my sister and been too scared to try. I opened my window as quietly as possible. The screen popped out easily. I climbed onto the roof of the garage, grateful Derek's house had good architectural handholds. From the garage roof, I could see into Derek's office window. The blinds were closed, but light showed through the gaps. I couldn't see Mia, couldn't see what he was doing to her. I dropped from the garage roof into the bushes below, stayed low, and ran toward the fence line. The Johnsons' house was 50 feet away. I was 10 feet from the fence when Derek's office door opened. I froze behind a decorative boulder, praying he hadn't seen me. His footsteps crossed the patio. I heard him call my name, checked my room, and found it empty. He called again, voice tight with anger. I stayed hidden behind the boulder, barely breathing. Derek walked the perimeter of the yard, checking the fence line, looking for signs of where I'd gone. He passed within 3 feet of my hiding spot. I could smell his cologne, hear him breathing heavily through his nose. After 5 minutes, that felt like hours. He went back inside. I waited another 2 minutes, then sprinted for the fence. I was over it in seconds, dropping into the Johnsons' perfectly manicured backyard. I ran to their back door and pounded hard enough to rattle the frame. Mrs. Johnson opened it, looking startled. I pushed past her into their kitchen and grabbed their landline phone off the wall. She asked what was wrong. I dialed 911. The operator answered, asking what my emergency was. I told her my little sister was having seizures and my stepfather wouldn't let me call for help. I gave her Derek's address. She asked if my sister was conscious. I said I didn't know, that Derek had carried her to his office and locked the door and threatened to make us disappear if I tried to get help. The operator's tone changed. She asked if I was safe. I said I was at the neighbor's house. She told me to stay there, that police and ambulance were being dispatched immediately, that I'd done the right thing by calling. Mrs. Johnson stood next to me, holding her husband's arm, both of them pale and confused. I explained as fast as I could that my sister was dying, and my stepfather had prevented me from calling 911. The sirens arrived within 6 minutes. 2 police cars and an ambulance converged on Derek's house with lights flashing. I ran back through the Johnsons' yard and over the fence, following the paramedics through Derek's front door. He stood in the foyer looking composed and confused, asking what the emergency was. I pointed at his office and told the officers my sister was in there. Derek said that was his private workspace, and they had no right to enter without a warrant. One officer told him to step aside or be arrested for obstruction. Derek moved. The officers opened his office door and found Mia on the leather couch, unconscious, an IV line running into her arm attached to a bag of clear fluid hanging from a coat rack. The paramedics swarmed immediately, assessing Mia's vitals and asking Derek what he'd given her. Derek claimed he was trying to help, that she was dehydrated and he was administering fluids. One paramedic checked the IV bag and called to his partner using medical codes I didn't understand. They disconnected the line, loaded Mia onto a stretcher, and rushed her to the ambulance. I tried to follow, but an officer held me back gently, saying they'd take good care of her, that I needed to stay and answer questions. Derek was already being questioned by the other officer, explaining in his calm, professional voice that he had medical training through his pharmaceutical work, that he was trying to prevent an unnecessary emergency room visit, that this was all a misunderstanding. The officer asking me questions was named Lieutenant Vargas. He had kind eyes and a notepad he wrote in carefully. He asked me to start from the beginning and tell him everything. I described Mia being sick all week, Derek refusing to let us see a doctor, the seizure, Derek ripping my phone away and threatening me. Lieutenant Vargas asked specifically what Derek had said. I repeated the threat word for word. Make sure you disappear. Nobody would trace it back. Vargas wrote it down and asked if Derek had ever threatened me before. I said no, but he controlled everything in the house. He monitored my mom's phone. He made all the decisions. My mom had changed since marrying him. Vargas asked where my mother was. I gave him her work number. He called her himself, explaining there was an emergency involving Mia and she needed to come home immediately. I couldn't hear my mom's response, but Vargas's expression was carefully neutral. He hung up and told me she was on her way. Then he asked to see Derek's office. I showed him the IV setup, the locked cabinet full of pharmaceutical samples, the mini fridge humming in the corner. Vargas opened the fridge with gloved hands. Inside were dozens of vials and syringes, medications with names I couldn't pronounce. He photographed everything with his phone. Then he asked me to wait in the living room while he spoke with Derek privately. Through the wall, I could hear Derek's voice rising for the first time. He was angry now, demanding to know what authority the police had to search his property, threatening to call his lawyer, insisting this was harassment. Vargas remained calm, explaining that when a child was transported to the hospital with an unauthorized IV line, that constituted grounds for investigation. That Derek would need to provide a detailed account of what medications he'd administered and why. That threatening a minor was a crime. That preventing someone from calling 911 during a medical emergency was potentially criminal negligence. Derek's voice dropped to something I couldn't hear. Vargas's response was clear. You can explain it to the detectives downtown. My mom arrived 30 minutes later, pulling into the driveway so fast she nearly hit a police car. She ran inside, demanding to know what happened, where Mia was, why there were police in her house. I tried to explain, but she wasn't listening. She was looking at Derek being questioned in the kitchen, looking at me with confusion and fear. She asked Derek what was going on. He told her in that same calm voice that there had been a medical emergency, and he'd tried to help, but I'd panicked and called 911, and now the police were treating him like a criminal for trying to keep Mia out of the hospital. My mom turned to me asking if that was true. I told her no, that Derek had threatened me to stop me from calling for help, that he'd put an IV in Mia and given her something. My mom's face went through several expressions: confusion, denial, anger. She told Vargas this was clearly a misunderstanding, that her husband had pharmaceutical training, that he'd obviously been trying to help their daughter. Vargas asked her if she'd authorized Derek to treat Mia with IV medications. She said she'd been at work. Vargas asked if she'd known Mia was sick enough to need IV treatment. She admitted she hadn't. Vargas gently explained that Derek had prevented me from calling 911 during a seizure, that he'd administered medications without medical supervision or parental consent, that Mia was currently being evaluated at the hospital, and we should go there immediately. My mom looked at Derek. He gave her this reassuring smile and told her everything would be fine, that the police were overreacting, that they'd sort this out. The hospital was chaos. We arrived to find Mia in the pediatric ICU, hooked up to more machines than I could count. A doctor met us in the hallway, a woman named Dr. Patel who looked exhausted and angry. She asked who'd administered the IV to Mia. My mom started to answer, but Dr. Patel cut her off. She said Mia had dangerously elevated levels of benzodiazepines in her system, far beyond what would be appropriate for a child her age and weight. She also had markers suggesting other medications had been given over several days. She asked again who had access to pharmaceutical-grade sedatives. My mom looked at Derek. Derek said he'd given Mia something to calm her during the seizure, that he'd done what any medical professional would do. Dr. Patel said no medical professional would give a seizing child benzodiazepines in those quantities without supervision. Dr. Patel turned to me and asked what I'd witnessed. I told her everything. The week of sickness, Derek dismissed as flu. The seizure he'd prevented me from reporting. The IV he'd set up in his office. Dr. Patel's expression darkened with each detail. She asked if I'd seen what was in the IV bag. I said no, but I could show police the cabinet where Derek kept his samples. Dr. Patel said the hospital had already contacted Child Protective Services, and the police would be conducting a full investigation. She asked to speak with my mother privately. They disappeared into a consultation room. Through the window, I could see my mom crying while Dr. Patel explained something that made her shake her head repeatedly. A CPS caseworker arrived an hour later. Her name was Monica Reeves, and she had a kind face that couldn't hide how seriously she was taking this. She interviewed me in a private room, recording everything on a small device. She asked detailed questions about Mia's illness, Derek's response, his threat when I tried to call 911. She asked about Derek's behavior in general, whether he'd ever been inappropriate with Mia or me, whether my mom knew about the pharmaceutical samples in his office. I answered everything as honestly as I could. Monica asked if I felt safe going home. I said I didn't know. She said that was okay, that they'd figure something out, that my safety was the priority. Mia woke up around midnight. I was allowed in to see her briefly. She looked tiny in the hospital bed, IVs in both arms, monitors beeping steadily. She asked what happened. I told her she'd had a seizure and we'd brought her to the hospital. She asked where Derek was. I said he wasn't here. She nodded and closed her eyes, looking relieved. That reaction told me something I hadn't wanted to consider. Mia was scared of Derek. Maybe she'd been scared for a while and I'd been too focused on my own discomfort to notice. I asked her quietly if Derek had ever hurt her. She didn't answer, just squeezed my hand once and fell back asleep. The toxicology reports came back Friday morning. Dr. Patel called a meeting with my mom, 2 detectives, Monica from CPS, and hospital administration. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I stood outside the conference room and listened through the door. Dr. Patel explained that Mia had been given multiple medications over the past week, benzodiazepines to sedate her, antiemetics that caused the vomiting they were supposed to treat, medications that induced fever and headaches. Someone had been systematically making Mia sick, then treating the symptoms they'd created, then making her sick again. The pattern was consistent with Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Someone was deliberately harming a child to play medical hero. My mom's voice through the door. That's impossible. Derek would never hurt Mia. He loves her. He's been trying to help her all week. Detective's voice. Ma'am, the evidence suggests your husband has been poisoning your daughter. Long silence. Then my mom screaming that they were wrong, that Derek was a good man, that there had to be another explanation. Monica's voice, calm and sad. Mrs. Price, we need to consider Mia's safety. Until this investigation concludes, neither you nor your husband can have unsupervised contact with her. My mom's voice breaking. You're taking my daughter away from me? Monica, we're protecting her. There's a difference. I slid down the wall outside the conference room and sat on the floor. Derek had been poisoning Mia, making her sick so he could play savior. It explained why he'd refused to let us take her to a doctor, why he'd prevented me from calling 911. A real doctor would have run tests and found the drugs in her system, would have asked questions Derek couldn't answer. He'd needed to control the narrative completely. My mom emerged from the conference room looking destroyed. She saw me on the floor and asked if I'd heard. I nodded. She said they were wrong, that Derek would explain everything, that this was a horrible mistake. I asked her why Mia seemed scared of him. My mom's face crumpled. She said she didn't know. Derek was arrested Friday afternoon. 2 detectives showed up at the house with a warrant. I watched from my bedroom window as they handcuffed him in the driveway. He didn't resist, just maintained that same calm demeanor, telling them this was a misunderstanding that his lawyer would clear up quickly. The detectives weren't rough, but they weren't gentle either. They put him in the back of an unmarked sedan and drove away. A forensics team arrived 30 minutes later and spent 6 hours photographing Derek's office, cataloging the pharmaceutical samples, bagging evidence. They took the IV equipment, the mini fridge, every vial and syringe. They took Derek's computer and several boxes of documents. The house felt violated when they finally left. My mom spent the weekend in denial. She hired an expensive lawyer for Derek, visited him in jail, told anyone who'd listen that this was a terrible mistake. She called her sister, Derek's parents, friends from work, building a narrative that the police were wrong and Derek was being persecuted. Nobody mentioned that Mia was still in the hospital being monitored for organ damage from the drugs she'd been given. Nobody asked why a pharmaceutical sales rep had enough medication in his home office to stock a small clinic. My mom had built her life around Derek, and accepting what he'd done would mean accepting that she'd endangered her own children. Denial was easier. CPS placed Mia in temporary foster care when she was released from the hospital. My mom fought it, but the judge agreed that returning Mia to our home posed unacceptable risk. Until the investigation concluded and Derek's trial ended, Mia would live with a vetted family who specialized in caring for children in crisis. My mom was allowed supervised visits twice a week. I was allowed unsupervised contact because I'd been the one to call for help. Mia's foster family, the Kims, were kind people with 2 daughters close to her age. They lived 20 minutes away in a neighborhood that felt safer than ours. When I visited, Mia seemed lighter somehow, less anxious. She slept better, ate better, smiled more. Away from Derek, she was becoming herself again. The investigation expanded in ways none of us expected. Detectives dug into Derek's past and found 2 previous marriages. Both had ended in divorce. Both ex-wives had children who'd experienced mysterious illnesses during their marriages to Derek. The first wife's son had been hospitalized 3 times for seizures that stopped completely after the divorce. The second wife's daughter had chronic respiratory issues that vanished when Derek moved out. Neither woman had connected their children's illnesses to Derek because the symptoms had seemed legitimate, and he'd been so helpful during the medical crises. The pattern was undeniable once you saw it. Derek had been making children sick and playing hero for at least 15 years. Derek's lawyer tried to build a defense around medical uncertainty. He argued that children got sick, that correlation wasn't causation, that Derek's pharmaceutical background made him seem suspicious when he'd actually been trying to help. But the evidence was overwhelming. The toxicology reports showing drugs in Mia's system that matched samples from Derek's office. The medical records from his ex-wife's children showing symptoms consistent with medication side effects. The timeline of Mia's illness escalating after Derek prevented medical intervention. Most damaging was the security camera Derek had installed in his office to monitor his pharmaceutical samples. He'd recorded himself preparing the IV that police found attached to Mia. The footage showed him calculating dosages, mixing medications, documenting everything in a journal. He'd kept meticulous records of his crimes. The trial started in October. I testified on the first day, describing what I'd witnessed. The defense attorney tried to suggest I'd misunderstood Derek's intentions, that I'd panicked during a medical emergency and jumped to conclusions. But I'd been clear and consistent from the beginning. Derek had prevented me from calling 911. He'd threatened to make us disappear. He'd carried my seizing sister to his office and administered unauthorized medications. The prosecutor played the security footage of Derek preparing the IV. The courtroom went silent, watching him work with professional precision, mixing drugs like he'd done it 100 times before. Because he had. Mia testified via video link because she was only 9, and the judge wanted to minimize her trauma. She sat in a comfortable room with Monica beside her and answered the prosecutor's questions. Yes, Derek had given her medicine that made her feel weird. Yes, he'd told her not to tell anyone. Yes, she'd been scared of him. The defense tried to suggest Mia had been coached, but her answers were too genuine, too childlike to be rehearsed. When asked why she hadn't told anyone Derek was making her sick, Mia said simply, "He said if I told, bad things would happen to my family. I didn't want bad things to happen." The jury looked at Derek with barely concealed disgust. Derek's ex-wives testified about their children's mysterious illnesses. The first wife, Patricia, described her son's seizures that no doctor could explain, how Derek had been so supportive, so helpful during hospitalizations, how the seizures stopped within weeks of their divorce and never returned. She'd thought it was coincidence. The second wife, Rachel, told similar stories about her daughter's respiratory crises, trips to the emergency room, Derek always there with medical knowledge and calming presence, the symptoms vanishing after he moved out. Rachel said she'd suspected something was wrong, but Derek had convinced her she was paranoid, that she was a bad mother for doubting him. The gaslighting had been as effective as the poisoning. The prosecution's expert witness was a toxicologist named Dr. Isaac Brenner, who'd reviewed all the medical records and evidence. He explained in clear terms how Derek had used his pharmaceutical knowledge to make children sick without leaving obvious traces, benzodiazepines to cause seizures, antiemetics that paradoxically caused vomiting when given in specific doses, medications that induced fever and headaches. Dr. Brenner said Derek had essentially been conducting human experiments on children, documenting their responses to various drugs, refining his methods. The journal police had seized was filled with notes about dosages, timing, symptoms. Derek had treated sick children like a research project. My mom attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row behind Derek. She still believed in him somehow. Or maybe she just couldn't accept the alternative. If Derek was guilty, then she'd failed to protect her children. She'd brought a predator into our home. She'd dismissed Mia's illness as minor when her daughter was being systematically poisoned. That knowledge would destroy her. So she chose to believe the police and prosecutors and doctors were all wrong. During breaks, she tried to talk to me. I avoided her. I couldn't forgive how she'd chosen Derek over Mia and me, how she'd let him control everything, how she still defended him even now. The defense's strategy was to paint Derek as a well-meaning man whose medical knowledge made him seem sinister. They brought character witnesses who testified about his volunteer work, his professional success, his generosity. None of it mattered. The evidence was too clear. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict on all counts. Guilty of child abuse, guilty of poisoning, guilty of assault with intent to cause bodily harm, guilty of preventing emergency communication, guilty on 18 separate charges covering 3 different children across 15 years. Derek showed no emotion, just sat there in his suit, looking like he was waiting for a meeting to start. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks later. The judge was a woman named Barbara Thornton, who'd been on the bench for 20 years. She'd seen terrible things, but Derek's case affected her visibly. She asked Derek if he wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Derek stood and delivered a 10-minute speech about how he'd been trying to help sick children, how he'd been persecuted for his medical knowledge, how the justice system had failed him. He never once acknowledged what he'd done, never apologized to Mia or his ex-wife's children, never showed remorse. Judge Thornton listened with an expression of increasing disbelief. When Derek finished, she told him she'd sentenced many defendants in her career, but none had shown such complete lack of empathy or awareness. She gave him the maximum on every count, sentences to run consecutively. 43 years in prison. Derek would be 81 before he was eligible for parole. Mia stayed with the Kims. My mom lost custody permanently because she'd demonstrated inability to protect her children from harm. CPS determined that returning Mia to my mom's care posed unacceptable risk, given her continued denial of Derek's guilt. My mom was allowed supervised visits once a month. She took it to court, but lost. The judge ruled that a parent's rights end when they endanger their child, even through willful blindness. My mom moved to a small apartment and got a lawyer to appeal. The appeal was denied. She stopped attending visits after 6 months, couldn't face seeing Mia happy and healthy with another family, couldn't face evidence that Mia was better off without her. I turned 18 3 months after Derek's sentencing. CPS had wanted to place me in foster care too, but I'd been old enough to petition for emancipation. A judge had granted it given the circumstances. I rented a room near my high school and got a job at a grocery store to cover expenses. It wasn't ideal, but it was mine. I visited Mia twice a week at the Kim's house. She called them Mom and Dad Kim, which was fine. They loved her in ways my mom had failed to. They believed her and protected her and gave her the childhood Derek had tried to destroy. When Mia turned 10, the Kims asked if I'd be okay with them adopting her officially. I said yes, immediately. The civil lawsuits took longer to resolve. Patricia and Rachel both sued Derek for damages to their children. Mia's case was still pending because she was a minor, and the Kims were navigating the legal system on her behalf. Derek had hidden assets through various shell companies and offshore accounts. The investigators found over $2 million he'd accumulated through pharmaceutical kickbacks and fraud schemes separate from his poisoning crimes. The money got frozen pending litigation. Derek's lawyer tried to protect it, but the court ruled that assets obtained through criminal activity could be seized. The victims split what was recovered. It wasn't nearly enough compensation for what Derek had done, but it meant Mia's therapy and medical bills would be covered for life. I graduated high school on time, despite everything. Mia and the Kims came to the ceremony. My mom wasn't invited. I'd cut contact completely after she sent me a letter saying Derek was innocent and I'd destroyed our family by calling 911 that day. She still couldn't see the truth. Still couldn't accept that her husband had spent 2 years poisoning her daughter. I'd made peace with losing her. Some relationships can't survive the truth. My mom had chosen comfortable lies over her children. That was her decision to live with. I was done trying to make her see reality. Mia thrived with the Kims. She joined soccer and discovered she was fast and competitive, made friends at her new school, started therapy with a trauma specialist who helped her process what Derek had done. The therapist said Mia was remarkably resilient, that children often are when they finally feel safe. Mia told me once that she barely remembered being sick anymore, that those months felt like they'd happened to someone else. I told her that was okay, that she didn't need to remember the bad parts. She said she remembered me climbing out the window to call 911 though, said she'd heard Derek threaten me, but I'd gotten help anyway, said she knew I'd always protect her. I started college 2 years later studying emergency medicine. The paramedics who'd responded to my 911 call had saved Mia's life. I wanted to do that for other people, wanted to be the person who showed up when someone called for help. My first day in the EMT training program, the instructor asked why we'd chosen this field. I told the truth. My stepfather had prevented me from calling 911 during a medical emergency and threatened to make me disappear if I got help. I'd called anyway. The paramedics who responded saved my sister's life and helped put a predator in prison. I wanted to be someone who answered calls that family members tried to prevent, someone who showed up for children whose parents failed them. Derek sent me a letter from prison 3 years after his conviction. I don't know how he got my address. The letter was 6 pages of single-spaced text maintaining his innocence and asking me to visit. He said if I'd just let him explain everything, I'd understand he'd been trying to help, that the medical establishment had persecuted him for his innovative treatment methods, that I'd ruined his life by overreacting to a simple seizure. I burned the letter without finishing it. Derek still didn't understand or wouldn't admit what he'd done. He'd spent 15 years making children sick to fulfill some twisted savior fantasy. He'd threatened a 15-year-old kid to avoid consequences. He'd destroyed 3 families and traumatized multiple children. There was no explanation that could justify any of it. Mia got married at 23 to a teacher she'd met in college. I walked her down the aisle because that's what big brothers do. The Kims sat in the front row crying happy tears. My mom wasn't invited. She'd reached out to Mia a few times over the years, but Mia had declined contact. Some wounds don't heal with time. Some relationships end permanently. The wedding was beautiful, and Mia was radiant, and there wasn't a single moment where anyone mentioned Derek or the 2 years he'd poisoned her. That part of her life was over. She'd survived and built something better. That was the only revenge that mattered. I'm 31 now, 16 years after I called 911 while my stepfather tried to stop me. I work as a paramedic in the same city where I grew up. I've responded to hundreds of calls. Many involve children, some involve family members who don't want us there, who insist everything's fine when it clearly isn't. I document everything carefully and involve authorities when necessary because I learned young that family loyalty stops being virtue when it enables harm, that protecting abusers makes you complicit, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make a call someone doesn't want you to make. Derek tried to prevent that call because he knew it would expose him. He threatened me because he knew truth was his enemy, but I called anyway. And that decision saved my sister's life and stopped a predator who'd hurt children for 15 years. Sometimes disobedience isn't rebellion. Sometimes it's survival. And sometimes the family member trying to prevent a 911 call is exactly why that call needs to be made. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.